blacklisted Hezbollah in its entirety as a proscribed terrorist organization, there's great momentum, but more needs to be done. Iran's proxies are rapidly infiltrating governments in the region with manpower, money, and material. If you guys could just keep it down, we have our guests coming on stage. This has the potential to worsen after the arms embargo on Iran under UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which expires in October 2020. After the Aramco attack, our world remain on the front lines of Iran's destabilizing designs. We have to remember our close allies are on the front lines of these threats and dangers. A key policymaker from those front lines, from the region, is here to help us understand the threat landscape. He's very wise. He's very serious. He, Abdullah, the ambassador of Bahrain to the United States. On top of being truly one of the most gracious men in the diplomatic community or really in policymaking, he's a trained fighter pilot and previously served as defense in Washington and Ottawa. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Mike Makovsky, because I screwed this up earlier by calling Mike Makovsky Norm, but we have Norman Roule, so you're going to get the benefit of two introductions. Norm is my dear friend, and there's no one else like Norm. 35 years, or 34 years actually, community, the lead intelligence analyst in various secret agencies of the United States of America and various senior posts, including, as reported, station chief and the like in the region, a true expert on Iran and a very wise man, my friend Norman Roule. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'd like to acknowledge, if I could, certainly not as a friend, our colleague, Ambassador Al-Taiba from the UAE, is also sitting in the room to provide his support. There he is, Yusuf. Hi, Yusuf.
Well, I'll begin by saying Mike Makovsky is much smarter than I am and certainly a lot thinner, so I'm willing to take the accolade. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to see you as always. We have a lot to talk about, so I'd like to dive right in. If I could you set the framework for us to talk about why Bahrain is important in the region? You've been for about 2 years. It's been an extraordinary time. It's hard to look at a newspaper in Washington without seeing an important Bahraini official engaging an important American official. You're in all the pictures, and you're always very well dressed. So it's always good. Can you tell us about Bahrain in the region and what is happening right now in that regard?
Well, thank you, Norm. Let me start out with thanking Senator Lieberman and Ambassador Wallace for all what they're doing with UANI. Let me also congratulate them for being designated as an FTO today. It means that the message is being heard, and I think that it plays an important and vital role in the cause that we're all here for today. I'll go back to why it's important that together and united. United against nuclear Iran does not mean one or two countries. It means a lot of countries standing up to the aggression that we have seen for the past 4 decades or so. Other countries are maybe on the forefront of malign activities, and Bahrain is surely one of them. And a couple of weeks prior to this event, we've seen a lot of engagement on our end when it comes to our officials in Washington. It's because of, first, the long-standing relationship that we have with the United States on defense, but also in security, trade, and other avenues, but predominantly because of the escalation in the region. We have seen that, and we have been anticipating an escalation. We have seen the Iranian regime aggressively moving towards more sophisticated attacks, and it's about time that there is more unification, not only in the Middle East, but also throughout the world, to push back on Iranian aggression. Let me start out with a couple of notes on Bahrain. Bahrain is 200 kilometers away from Iran. It is probably closer to Bushehr than Tehran. And so for us, the nuclear activities in the region is definitely a challenge. Now, when I say that Bahrain has always been on the forefront of Iranian aggression, it's due to many reasons.
Well, they attempted to overthrow your country on your government on several
occasions. We've seen that cycle for 40 years now. We still remember a time when we worked with the Shah. The Shah was a more reasonable person. And we had to deal with a regime that has an expansionary vision in the region. It saw Bahrain as a weak link, but we have proven time and time again that we will not accept their interference in our internal affairs. We were very grateful for the support that we from neighbors in helping us to push back on Iranian aggression. And over a period of time, we have realized that there is a formula that the Iranian regime has developed. When I say Iranian regime, it's important, I think, to distinguish between and the Iranian people. We've worked with the Iranian people on many occasions in many different sectors and fields, and it is our belief that the Iranian people deserve a better quality of life, a better governance, and regime in place. We've seen the outcome of where Iran is today.
And you've felt this directly, I think, with Bahrain, certainly with the United Arab Emirates, and most recently with Saudi Arabia. You are where the hammer is hitting. And when I think of Bahrain, in my old world, obviously we were concerned and worked to protect many partners, but it won't come as a surprise that protecting Americans was our #1 priority, wherever they are in the world. There are thousands of Americans in Bahrain, hundreds of thousands of Americans in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates who live very happily there. And I often tell people Iranian missiles don't turn left and right over the heads of Americans or Brits or Europeans. So in addition to everything you do protect the Americans in your country, and which we owe you a debt of gratitude.
When the United States and Bahrain worked out an agreement for us to host the Fifth Fleet, we knew that there was an obligation on us to protect U.S. personnel in Bahrain. We have the only DoD-managed school in the region, a school that had seen our Crown Prince graduate from, his son graduate from, and it has really provided a space for Bahrainis and Americans to learn together. And these are some of the byproduct experience. But with the presence of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, we felt obligated, and that's what we're working to achieve. Looking at the defense component of the relationship, we definitely have strengthened it. We have been very clear in the defense policies that come out of the Pentagon, and it has just made life easier for me as an ambassador because we're not going against different ideas. But the Iranians have the Iranian regime a challenge here.
So let's talk about the threat. And I'd like to widen the aperture just a little bit from the title. Since about 2003, but certainly since 2011, Iran has armed, trained, funded, directed, or at least influences a Sunni and Shia militancy, which is capable of fighting on different battle spaces or disconnected battle spaces against different foes simultaneously. It numbers more than 100,000. It includes everything from elements of the Taliban to Kataib Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis, et cetera, et cetera. Changed, in my view, the DNA of the region, perhaps at least for a generation or two. How do the people of Bahrain and the people of the region see this massive transformation of the neighborhood through militias. How is this perceived?
Let me give you, and then we'll talk on a macro level. And because nowadays everybody loves props, I brought some with me. A picture is worth 1,000 words. But
the Israelis would appreciate that.
But we have seen strategic messaging come out of the Iranian regime for the past 2 decades or so, with what they have called the legitimate annexation of Bahrain. As a sovereign country today, that rhetoric is unacceptable. It's unacceptable in Bahrain, it's unacceptable in the region, and it's unacceptable worldwide. But the Iranian regime has invested a lot in training and recruiting militant groups. Where do they do that? Either in Iran or in Iraq. They exploit religious sermons or religious causes for Bahrainis to travel to Iraq on religious trips for that kind of training. One of the areas that we have seen is a training camp that is organized between Najaf and Karbala. A picture of that training camp, and it's basically just showing off some of the equipment that the Iranians use, trying to recruit more and more people.
And the people trained at these camps are Bahrainis, but also other nationals, to include potentially Americans.
Of course. But we've gotten better at tracking some of the weapons that have come into Bahrain. And we've done it through support from neighbors and allies, but that wasn't enough. And so what we worked with the U.S. administration and showcasing some of the equipment that was confiscated. A lot of what's in here are small arms. These weapons have been smuggled into Bahrain. There are markings and logos that show that they go back to Iran. We have used U.S. research entities based in Washington, D.C., actually, to recognize these small arms. And they are today displayed at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling and 20 minutes away from Washington. Another thing that scares us is knowledge. So we have seen IEDs produced in Bahrain using components that came from Iran. We have used research centers to show us and compare some of the IEDs found in Yemen and in Iraq. And it has been proven that those IEDs contain this, that point the finger back to Iran. We have also seen small factories in small villages in Bahrain. This is a picture of a machine that was used to create explosively formed penetrators, EFPs.
So the exploder requires very specific machining and is extraordinarily lethal. It's the weapon introduced by Iran and Iraq, which is responsible for many of the lethalities and injuries to hundreds of, if not thousands of injuries to U.S. Forces in Iraq.
Another thing that we've realized is the cyber attacks on the cyber domain, public and private, which is creating a challenge.
So all of this has been conducted against Bahrain because you are indeed the closest, and Iran has viewed you as a target for many years against your neighbors. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, they also feel these threats. So I want to ask you a question, maybe a provocative question, put you on the spot, okay? Your foreign minister and the king are all watching. Right now, you were preceded by the Israeli ambassador, and Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes to deter Iran from setting up military bases. They've had an aircraft shot down at one time. That's an air war. The Saudis have endured an unprecedented missile attack on their country of a number and intensity certainly not seen since the Iran-Iraq War, and I sometimes wonder if it hasn't been seen since the attacks on London in the Second World War. With drones and the number of drones and the number of missiles. You have Iranian ground troops in the region, in 3 or 4 countries. And you have cyber attacks against the civilian infrastructure, and you have the support of terrorism. If this were combined, all these actions were combined against one country, this would be called, because Iran has disaggregated this against the region, it often doesn't make page 3 of many U.S. newspapers. So I ask you, is the region at war with Iran? Is this an actual war against Iran?
That's a very good question. I think that I heard a U.S. Official a short while ago say that if we had counted the acts of war that were initiated by the Iranian regime in the past months or so, we would come to a number of 12. So there is a serious escalation in the region. There are serious efforts to de-escalate.
So let me just pull the thread on that. The attack on Abqaiq and Khurais was certainly a large, sophisticated, unprecedented attack. But there have been attacks by missiles and drones against facilities in the kingdom. There have been, the Houthis have tweeted that they have attacked, but thank God it didn't happen or it was a lie, the United Arab Emirates. You have had attacks by Houthis with explosive ships against oil shipping in the Red Sea. Is it an escalation, or is it just that in this time where they had a signal success and we could have had something like this a year ago or 2 years ago while the U.S. was still in JCPOA?
No, I think that the reaction that we're seeing from the Iranian regime means that the sanctions are really working. And what the Iranians are, they're trying to provoke some sort of reaction to further escalate. I think that the U.S., countries in the region, have been very wise in dealing with the situation. The formation of coalitions to deter provocative action from the Iranian regime is the right thing to do. When the idea of a maritime security construct was discussed, Bahrain was probably the first country to jump on after the United Kingdom, because we do believe that that's the way forward with the Iranian regime today. We have heard how the U.S. administration is looking at a way to isolate the Iranian regime in an effort to bring them to the table. I think that going back to a JCPOA is not acceptable. The JCPOA at the time, when the leaders came to Camp David, it was a call from the United States. It was a call from the country that we consider one of the biggest allies to us in the region. And, well, the Iranian regime has blown that chance. We've seen where that $150 billion has gone into. We've seen a serious escalation in internal security attacks. And I honestly don't want to go through it again in Bahrain.
Sure. I think many people position. But let me again challenge you. So Bahrain represents a diverse series of cultures, multinational population, many Americans, small Jewish community even, which worships freely. If you have this as a target, such an overt target by Iran, is it so difficult to gain support from some of our European friends and partners traditionally on a threat to your people, your security, and the people who are guests in your country? Why has this traditionally been such a problem?
It has been a problem because countries have not realized that we did. And that's why it is our job to use platforms like this to illustrate what we've been through.
So you're being very diplomatic, but I would challenge you and say, have the European embassies in Manama gone home? Or the Europeans or the Russians or in the Gulf who see this threat, do they not write home or talk to home?
Well, we saw how the E3 came together yesterday and
put
out
and that's
the statement.
Important.
And that's very important. It's important at this time to stand behind the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
So what does this mean in standing with the Gulf? Your country, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, I think there was an expectation by some in the United States that there would be a frenetic drive for war, and that has not happened. It's been very mature. It's the type of seasoned thinking. Some might wish for a strike earlier, but I think it's been very seasoned. What do you think the international that would tangibly impact the decision-making in Tehran to deter what I think is the most important thing we ought to consider, which is less punishing or dealing with the attack of last week, but preventing a similar attack tomorrow, be it a cyber attack on your country or a missile or drone attack on yourself or one of the neighbors? What are you doing?
We're already seeing it. When the UK, Germany, and France come out and say, yes, we do believe that the attack came from the north, it came from the Iranian regime, then that means that they have recognized that what the Iranian is trying to provoke a bigger problem in the region. The UK has already put out that it's going to send troops to the region. The US has already said that it's going to also increase its presence. And I think all of this goes on managing what's happening in the region. If we were to see an escalation really quickly, that would mean that the Iranian regime has gotten what it wants.
And the conflict would be fought not only on your front door, but your living rooms, it's fought in your front yard, it's fought on your territory.
Exactly. And so I think the maximum pressure campaign is working. There has to be more isolation, there has to be more pressure. We will see a bit more problem.
Mm-hmm. When people, I've had people tell me this recently, officials from the region, when diplomacy is considered, which is always the first and last answer, we should always go for diplomacy. Diplomacy means negotiations, correct? You're a seasoned diplomat. Mm-hmm. For negotiations to succeed, you must have compromise. Each side must... what do you give Iran in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen? What is it, and dealing with Iran's surrogates, is it possible to talk to Hezbollah as a formal entity without dealing with the devil? And I know we're the great, we'll let someone else be the devil for the conversation.
Hezbollah is another great example. People in the past talked about political wing, military wing, and it's one organization. It's an organization that we have dealt with in the 90s. It's one up until 2009, actually. Here, this is another one. This picture shows...
You really thought about these questions in advance, didn't you?
I
just got to keep this 3x5 card a little closer. I think he really he really put a lot of good thought into this.
You look at this picture and you think Beirut. But this was actually flags in Manama in 2009 with the pictures of the clerics in the front. There were one or two more flags that we didn't show in the picture, properly presented. But had we let that activity go forward, we would have ended up with a similar situation as in Lebanon. But we pushed back, but we worked with partners to try to make sure that we raise awareness. The police had to change the way in which they operate. So we went from a public order police force to a more community-focused police force. We had a lot of community work, community police officers entity was established. We had programs in the schools. Minister just launched a national identity program with more than 70 initiatives. And these are all tools to push back on the IRGC has used in the past to try to capture some of the youngsters and get them into the programs that they have developed. And so it's important for, and this is how I look. This is how I see it. I see it as countries with governments and other countries with dysfunctional governments. And there are two ways to deal with it. With countries that have proper governments, it's easier because you just have to make the community more aware. You have to track finances. You have to make sure that to par, or else the IRGC will find a way to penetrate the community.
So for countries dealing with Hamas, the title of this 50 minutes is Hamas and the Houthis, Hezbollah. What is there a common thread on how the neighboring countries where these entities are strongest should deal with this? I'm not sure that such a thing exists. The Saudis have attempted to speak to the Houthis. There's certainly been a lot of aid from the Gulf that have gone to the people of Yemen. It's not often discussed that the war and the conflict is indeed I think the Saudis will admit this among others, but you're also a member of the coalition. But your response to the Houthis is different than your response to Kataib Hezbollah or Lebanese Hezbollah, and your response to Hamas is different as well. It seems to me there are very different flavors of regional responses that have to be put forward.
Well, obviously, local priorities are, we have Hezbollah Bahrain on our doorstep, and so we had to deal with that entity first. We're part of the coalition. The Houthis, we had this discussion a couple of nights ago from Washington, and he said the Houthis are very different than Hezbollah because of the way they were initiated, they started out.
Right.
But at the end of the day, both entities morphed into the same animal.
And the flags are similar. Their rhetoric, their relationship with Iran is similar. The relationship with Iran would be stronger if there was a stronger logistics line and if you follow the same pattern elsewhere in the region. I've always seen the Houthis as a mixture of Lebanese Hezbollah with a splash of ISIS and a splash of sort of a tribal nationalist. It's a different type of creature than Lebanese Hezbollah. But when you talk to those outside the region in Europe, do we understand the differences between these groups? I mean, there doesn't seem the same sense of urgency in many capitals as there is in the region.
There's a different perception in Europe. And it is very important that the Europeans recognize what the region is going through and how their countries might get influenced from it, either directly or indirectly. We've seen what happened with the oil prices and how it's... When did it happen? When did the prices go back?
Right.
Is a matter that says that the IRGC is taking calculated decisions.
So we're back to the IRGC, we're back to the export of religion. Let me touch on a comment of one of the previous speakers, the Murad, a very, very wise man who was with Mike. He talked about Iran being a cause. Henry Kissinger has once stated that Iran has got to decide whether Iran is a cause or a country. First, is the problem less Iran needs to make that decision because we can't treat it simultaneously, effectively both ways? And if you agree or disagree with that, how do the people of the region, you could speak for Bahrain or your sense of the people in the region, do you see Iran as a cause or a country? And if you see them as both, aren't you just as ineffective as we've been?
I've said many times, we believe that theofascism cannot exist in this day and age. And that's exactly where the IRGC is. As long as first of all, they discredit the intentions of the Iranian people when the revolution first happened. The exportation of the revolution does exactly that. So if you have a country in the region with hegemonic ambitions that are not going to change, that really creates a problem. And the only way to deal with it is... the
problem is you have a country with people who have... Iran should play a role in regional environmental issues, refugee issues, seismic issues, a variety of normal state activities. You would want their partnership. But if they've nested their revolutionary organs inside of state structures, the revolution elements without simultaneously hitting elements of the state. And hence we had the great debate on do you sanction the IRGC for so many years, and then finally the Trump administration made the decision to do so. Is it possible for us to attack the revolutionary elements without also addressing Iran as a country?
Look at the IRGC, for example. We've designated the IRGC in October of 2018 because we have we have seen the influence of the IRGC. When more and more countries designate the IRGC, when more and more countries designate the Central Bank of Iran, I think it's a clear message that the Iranian regime needs to change its behavior in the region.
So I will agree with you, but I will add to it. I think it takes more than a stiffly worded démarche and a statement by government capitals. I think wherever the IRGC is allowed to go to maintain personnel, that country is abetting Iran's regional activities, which threaten not only Bahrainis, but the Americans and nationals of many countries who are happy and pleased to live in your country.
Absolutely.
So in our remaining time, and I'm getting the hook saying that they have to keep on schedule, what do you think we've missed on the UN right now should be focusing on most stringently beyond multilateral pressure in a big, broad, general way?
Just addressing the call from the Iranian people, we know and we hear that the Iranian people are not happy with the call handed by the regime. And focusing on their needs, focusing on their outlook, focusing on Iran being a productive country in the region is where we need to go. I know it's not easy, but the more we can unite, if we can tie in Europe, then it becomes all the more easier to achieve. But at the end of the day, we have to keep doing what we're doing and expose how our communities are being challenged by the IRGC. What have we done